Picture this for a moment. You arrive at the airport wearing your best suit. A porter takes your luggage before you even reach the check-in counter. There are no crowded boarding groups, no baggage fees, no rush for overhead bin space. Instead, you're welcomed by name, handed a cocktail before takeoff, and escorted to a spacious seat where a freshly prepared steak will soon be served on fine china. And then, there were the stewardesses. To millions of men who flew during the 1960s, they became one of the most unforgettable parts of the journey. Always elegant, always composed, always smiling. Looking back, it sounds almost too perfect. So why would airlines spend this much money pampering people just to fly them from one place to another? Because flying wasn't ordinary transportation yet. It was expensive, exclusive, and still carried enormous social status. But that only explains why flying was special. It doesn't explain why airlines treated the passenger himself like the important part of the journey. And once you see what happened before the airplane even left the gate, the rest of the jet age starts to make sense. These are 10 forgotten ways 1960s airlines treated men like royalty. Number 10. The airport treated you like a guest. Why would a porter take your luggage before you even reach the check-in counter? Because in the early 1960s, airlines weren't trying to make the airport process as cheap and efficient as possible. They were trying to make the passenger feel important. Air travel was something very few people could afford. Adjusted for inflation, many international tickets cost several $1,000s today. Executives, celebrities, diplomats, and wealthy families made up a much larger share of the traveling public. And if a man had spent that kind of money on a ticket, airlines wanted him to notice where his money had gone. Uniformed porters handled luggage. Check-in counters were quiet. Boarding rarely felt rushed. Men arrived in tailored suits and ties because flying itself carried status. But there was a reason the airlines cared so much about how a man felt before he even reached the aircraft. They weren't selling him a seat. They were selling him an experience. And there was one person who embodied that experience more than anyone else. But what did airlines actually demand from the women they put at the center of that image? Number 9. The woman who had to be perfect. Why were stewardesses expected to look and behave so differently from ordinary airline employees? Because airlines weren't simply hiring people to serve food. They were building an entire image around them. Pan Am, TWA, Eastern, and BOAC maintained strict standards involving height, weight, appearance, and in many cases, marital status. Then came intensive safety and service training. Some spoke multiple languages. Some had nursing backgrounds. They were expected to remain calm during emergencies while simultaneously delivering polished hospitality. Even the uniforms were carefully designed. Emilio Pucci created iconic looks that became symbols of the jet age. But here's where the story gets more interesting. The stewardess wasn't simply supposed to look elegant. She was supposed to make a passenger feel as though the airline knew he was there. She could remember his name, notice his preferences, engage in conversation when her duties allowed. That personal attention is part of why so many passengers remembered individual stewardesses decades later. But there was another way airlines made the passenger feel personally important, and it arrived on a plate. Number 8. The meal was designed to make you forget you were flying. What would it take to convince a man sitting inside a metal tube at 30,000 feet that he was eating in a fine restaurant? In the 1960s, airlines had an answer. Porcelain, silverware, glass stemware, white linen, and real food. Steaks were carved fresh. Lobster appeared on international routes. Roast beef, smoked salmon, and gourmet desserts could arrive course by course. Some airlines employed professional chefs to design menus, and Pan Am became known for cuisine reflecting destinations across Europe, Asia, and South America. But the food itself wasn't the whole trick. The meal was deliberately slowed down. The stewardess served each course rather than dropping a tray in front of you. Refills came without passengers having to ask. People had time to talk. And that's where the airline was doing something much smarter than simply feeding passengers. It was turning time into part of the luxury. But then comes the obvious question. If airlines were already giving passengers elaborate meals, what else could they possibly give away for free? The answer was something many passengers would have expected to pay for. Number 7. The drink was free. Why would an airline give a businessman whiskey, gin, champagne, or a cocktail without charging him separately? Because in the jet age, the drink wasn't being treated as an extra. It was part of the ticket. Before the plane reached cruising altitude, a stewardess could arrive with a silver tray and proper glassware. Pan Am became known for premium international beverages. European carriers emphasized their wines and spirits. Businessmen could have a drink after a long day of meetings, talk with the stranger beside them, and simply relax. But here's the part that matters. Airlines weren't giving away alcohol because it was cheap. They were giving away the feeling that the passenger had already paid for everything he needed. No little charge appearing at the end. No decision about whether the drink was worth another $12. It was simply brought to you. And that philosophy extended to something far more expensive than a cocktail. The airline was willing to give up something it could have sold: space. Number 6. They were willing to sacrifice seats. What is the most expensive luxury an airline can give a passenger? Food costs money. Drinks cost money. But there is one thing an airline can only give away once: space. In the 1960s, fewer seats could mean greater comfort, and airlines could justify that because passengers were paying premium prices. Legroom was generous. Seats were wider. Armrests belonged to one passenger. Some aircraft even had lounge areas where travelers could socialize. The Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 combined jet-age speed with cabins airlines proudly advertised for their comfort. But here's the catch. Every empty inch of cabin was also potential revenue. As more people began flying, airlines discovered that another row of seats meant another group of passengers paying for tickets. So the economics changed. More passengers, more seats, less space. And eventually, comfort gave way to efficiency. But airlines still had one place where they could preserve the old feeling without putting it at 30,000 feet. The airport lounge. And what happened inside those lounges was almost a miniature version of the entire jet age. Number 5. The airport had its own private world. What was an airport lounge before it became a room filled with people staring at laptops? It was supposed to feel like an elegant hotel. Soft leather chairs, fresh flowers, views of the aircraft outside, cocktails and pastries. Some lounges offered full meals prepared by professional chefs. Pan Am's Clipper lounges became symbols of international prestige, while BOAC, Air France, and Lufthansa created their own versions. But businessmen weren't simply sitting there waiting for a boarding announcement. The lounge could become an office. Deals were discussed. Partnerships formed. Conversations continued over coffee. The journey had already begun before the aircraft left the runway. But that raises another question. Why did everybody in these spaces look like they were going somewhere important? The answer wasn't an airline rule. It was something even more powerful. Everybody knew how they were supposed to dress. Number 4. You didn't need a dress code. What would happen if an airline didn't require a man to wear a suit, but almost everyone wore one anyway? That's exactly what happened. Tailored suits, polished shoes, ties, sometimes hats. Women arrived in dresses, gloves, and styled hair. There wasn't necessarily a written rule forcing passengers to dress this way. The social expectation did the job. Flying represented success. so people dressed as though they were participating in something important. Look at photographs from the era. Terminal crowds can look less like travelers waiting for transportation and more like guests arriving at an exclusive event. And this wasn't simply vanity. The clothing reinforced the entire illusion the airlines were selling. If everyone around you looked important, the journey itself felt important. But then there was one part of this elegant world that would look absolutely absurd today. A man could sit down in his immaculate suit, order a scotch, and light a cigarette. And nobody thought that was strange. Number 3. You could smoke at 30,000 feet. How different was the world above the clouds? Here's one answer. Passengers could smoke during the flight. Ashtrays were built into armrests. Some larger aircraft had designated smoking areas. Businessmen could pair a cigarette with a scotch. Stewardesses carried branded matchbooks and emptied ashtrays as they moved through the cabin. And cigarette companies actively partnered with airlines, helping turn smoking into part of the glamorous jet age image. But here's the important distinction. Smoking wasn't considered a luxury because it was healthy. It was considered sophisticated because the social rules surrounding it were completely different. The health consequences weren't understood in the same way. That eventually changed. Research linked smoking with serious disease. Regulations followed. By the early 2000s, commercial airlines worldwide had banned smoking on board. So why does this strange detail matter to a story about luxury? Because it reveals how much more than the aircraft itself has changed. The entire social world surrounding flying changed. And there was one final thing airlines sold that wasn't food, alcohol, or comfort. They sold an identity. Number 2. The trip became part of who you were. Why would a businessman keep his luggage tags or ticket folders long after the flight was over? Because the trip itself could become proof of what he'd accomplished. International travel was still relatively rare. Boarding a Pan Am, TWA, BOAC, or Air France flight could represent professional success. Executives collected luggage tags. They kept ticket folders. Airlines supplied travel kits containing eye masks, socks, combs, and branded toiletries. These were small objects, but they gave the passenger something to take home, evidence that he'd been somewhere. And the flight itself could become part of his working life. Contracts were reviewed in the cabin. Partnerships began. Strangers became business contacts. Flying wasn't necessarily lost time. For some businessmen, it was productive time. But there was a bigger reason those little souvenirs mattered. They preserved a version of flying that was already disappearing. Because the industry was about to discover something that would change the entire equation. The more people who could afford to fly, the harder it became to treat every passenger like royalty. Number 1. The Golden Age ended when flying became ordinary. So what actually killed the Golden Age? It wasn't one bad airline decision. It wasn't that passengers suddenly stopped wanting good food or comfortable seats. It was success. By the early 1970s, commercial aviation was becoming accessible to millions more people. The Boeing 747 helped open international travel to ordinary families. That was enormous progress. But more passengers changed the economics. Then came the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, increasing competition and shifting attention toward lower fares. And once airlines competed more aggressively on price, the question changed. Instead of, how do we make this passenger feel important? The industry increasingly had to ask, how do we carry more passengers for less money? The consequences followed. More seats, less space. More standardized food, less personal service. And none of it happened overnight. One extra row, one reduced service, one less employee, one cheaper meal. Until eventually, the things that had once seemed ordinary became the things people now remember as luxury. And that is the strange irony of the jet age. The airlines didn't lose the Golden Age because they failed. They lost it because they succeeded at making flying available to almost everybody. The Golden Age wasn't perfect. Stewardess hiring standards were often unfair. Flying remained inaccessible to most Americans. Smoking on airplanes certainly wasn't healthy. And many of the things people remember fondly came with serious drawbacks. But something about that era still captures people's imagination. Because for a brief period, airlines weren't simply selling transportation. They were selling the feeling that the journey itself mattered. You dressed for the flight. A porter handled your luggage. A stewardess knew your name. You could drink a cocktail before takeoff. Eat a steak from a porcelain plate. Stretch out in a seat with room around you. Talk to a stranger. And arrive at your destination carrying a little piece of the experience home with you. That's why old Pan Am advertisements, vintage photographs, and faded Super 8 footage still feel so strange. They don't simply show an older airplane, they show an entirely different idea of what it meant to travel. The airplane wasn't just something that took you somewhere. For a few hours, it was the destination. And perhaps that's the part people really miss. Not the cigarettes, not the inconvenience, not the fact that flying was expensive. The ceremony. The feeling that stepping through an aircraft door meant entering another world. And that world is gone. But if you could have one flight from that era restored exactly as it was, which airline would you choose?